And welcome to At Issue. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is H. Wayne Wilson. And as we celebrate the holidays, whether that be Kwanzaa or Christmas or Hanukkah, we're going to celebrate one other thing. 2016 is a birthday for the city of Peoria, the 325th birthday of Peoria. No, not under the name of Peoria, but the first permanent, if I may use that term, establishment was in 1691, right here along the shores of what was known back then maybe as Lake Pimatui. I don't know if that was exactly what they called it then, but we're going to talk about the birthday of Peoria by looking at history from 1673, when Marquette and Joliet came up the river, to 1691, the first establishment, up to about World War II. We're going to do that real briefly here on That Issue with a panel of historians, including John Leyland, who is here. Thank you for being with us. Also with us is Mark Johnson, and then we have Marilyn Leyland, and they are husband and wife, and across from them is Mike Wyatt. Mike Wyatt not only is a local historian, but he is the interim director of the Illinois State Museum and the director of Dixon Mounds Museum. So thank you so much.
Thank you, H.
To all of you for joining us in the conversation. And I mentioned 1673, that Marquette and Joliet, but let's go back even further. What was it about this river valley that attracted the human beings?
Do you know, when you look at river valleys around the world, they are the hearths of civilization, and this river is no exception to that. A characteristic about this river valley that's noteworthy, however, is this big lake we know as Pimatui or Fat Lake or Lake Peoria. It is a powerhouse of ecological diversity, a place where you can get a meal almost any day you like. When we look at the prehistoric record of people living here, it is abundantly clear that they find the aquatic resources of this location to be especially important to their way of life.
Now, there was a group of Native Americans known as the Mississippians, who we know quite a bit about. What era was that? And they came to this whole stretch of the Illinois.
Yes, there is a remarkable development, really a pivotal development in Native American history and more broadly in human history, when people begin to cultivate plants. And what we see in this stretch of the river, somewhere around 1,000 years AD, corn agriculture begins to take root. This transforms the way of life by providing food essentially all year round. You grow it, you have green corn ceremonies when it first fruits and is edible. Later it can be harvested and stored into the winter. Some is set aside for seed stock. That simple equation leads to substantial villages. Up and down this river, from Lake Peoria down to about the mouth of the Sangamon River, there are a sequence of big villages that may have numbered 1,000 people each that are occupied for 200 or 300 years. And then, for reasons that are not clear to us, that way of life begins to fall apart, and there's a hiatus in human occupation of this river valley.
And there were several different tribes, the Oneota, the Mississippians, but they all disappeared? Can we use that term? Yes,
I think to the best of our knowledge it is disappeared. We see these big villages occupied with substantial numbers of people. They may not be all coeval, in other words, occupied at the same time. They seem to start to come apart in the late 1200s. In the 1300s, the early 1300s AD, another group, Oneota, we think they hail from probably Iowa, southern Wisconsin, Minnesota, a distinctive way of life. They move into this river valley, and archaeological excavations we've conducted for the past decade have given us real insight into their way of life, and they are clearly not Mississippian people. They're here into the late 1300s, and then we move between this time period of late 1300s, early 1400, to the time that Marquette and Joliet come upriver in 1673. And we don't have a very clear understanding, in fact, no understanding at all, if someone is living here, and if so, who they are.
But in 1673, when Marquette and Joliet came up the Illinois, they did meet with some Native Americans. Is that not true?
Yes, they do recount to us that in fact there are people living mostly in the upper reach of the lake. They don't tell us much about the lower reach when they get to the confluence of the Illinois and the Mississippi. The first relation that Marquette gives us in his narratives is what an extraordinary river valley it is, the fact it has a natural abundance, and he recounts the kinds of plants and animals that he sees. In fact, I think he says something like, "We've never seen a stream quite like this," which is noteworthy because he spent the previous many weeks on the Mississippi River. As they move upstream, eventually by the time they get to this stretch of the river and beyond, they begin to note that there are people living in this area. Not the Mississippian people or the Oneota, however. It turns out to be a group that they call the Illinois.
So the archaeological record shows between Oneota and Mississippian and 1673, we don't know much at all about this area of the state of Illinois.
That's exactly right.
Or the entire state of Illinois.
Or the entire state, in fact. In far southern Illinois, there is a Mississippian community called Kincaid, which persists beyond the well-being of Cahokia, the big city at St. Louis. It lasts into the early part of the 1400s, but even there appears to be a hiatus in which we're not sure, one, where Mississippian people go, and two, if they're supplanted by another group of people, who they are, until we begin to get the historical chronicle of other tribes moving into the area.
Mark, with Mike's prelude to the first establishment, we know that Marquette and Joliet came up the river, but they did not have a permanent establishment here. They stopped and then they continued on. What's the record show in terms of our first, if we may call it, permanent establishment?
Well, after Marquette and Joliet, then there's another famous French explorer that everyone should recognize by the name of La Salle, who came down the Illinois River and constructed Fort Creve Coeur, which is one of the most famous historical mysteries in the state of Illinois because it was the first structure constructed by Europeans, and the exact location has never been determined. There still is quite a bit of controversy about where that fort was. But on a subsequent voyage down the river then, La Salle finally made it to the mouth of the Mississippi, and on his trip back up the river, they stopped at Starved Rock and constructed a fort atop the rock and began a trading outpost at Starved Rock. And that French trading outpost at the rock existed for about 10 years. It was so popular with the Native Americans that there are stories that the population of the Indian villages around the rock grew to as high as 20,000 individuals. And you can imagine how difficult it was then to find firewood or food for the hunters. So after about 10 years, some of the Indian tribes decided that they would relocate down here to Lake Pimatuhi, and the French decided to move with them. So that was 1691 when they established the first French outpost here at the lake. There was also a Jesuit priest with them, and he established a mission. It's important to remember this was only 70 years after the English landed at on the Mayflower at
Plymouth Rock.
Plymouth Rock. So 70 years later, the French are all the way inland here in the Illinois Territory.
And I want to make it clear that this was French territory. The British weren't here at that time.
Yes, that's an important point, H. When La Salle got down to the mouth of the Mississippi, he claimed the entire Mississippi River drainage system for the King of France. So the entire middle portion of the United States was French territory at that time.
Henri de Tonty is a name that we come across every once in a while. There's one street. The only record of anything Tonty in this town that's left is a street down the south end of Peoria called Tonty Circle. But Henri de Tonty played a role here too.
When La Salle was murdered in Texas on one of his subsequent expeditions, the king granted the Illinois Territory to Tonty. He was one of La Salle's primary lieutenants, and then he operated the trading outpost at Starved Rock for about 10 years, and he also was in charge of the move of that outpost down here to Peoria.
So the French basically were traders
Yes, that's an important distinction to remember. You know, we all have the movie Jeremiah Johnson in our minds, and the out there trapping in the dead of winter. No, the French were traders, so they would allow the Native Americans to gather the pelts, whether they were beaver or buffalo or deer. I brought along an example of a beaver pelt. I mean, this is exactly why they were here. And they would then gather those pelts from the native in both the spring and the fall. From here in Peoria, they took most of those pelts back up to the French outpost at what we today would call Mackinac Island or Michilimackinac, where they would have huge rendezvous, and from there the pelts would be shipped back to Montreal and Quebec.
Was there a declining trade up until, because the French had influence here till about the War of 1812, if I recall correctly?
Well, Tonty stayed here for 10 years. And he left after that period because the fur trade had really declined, where it was not very profitable. Some of that was because of restrictions that the King of France had placed on the beaver trade in America. But after 10 years, he moved on down further south to New Orleans. But the French village then existed here all the way up through the War of 1812. When we look at it, maybe 50 families, maybe 150 people. Now, most of the Frenchmen that lived here probably had Native American wives and mixed breed children, and they would still trade back with in Canada with Quebec and Montreal. Very well, really, none of them spoke English. So later on, as the Americans settled in southern Illinois, there was a lot of suspicion about this little outpost who lived very comfortably in Native American country. In the 121 years that the French existed here, there is never a record of a raid on the French village, of anything being burned. They had a very cooperative arrangement with the Native Americans.
But in 1812, the village was burned.
Yeah.
Yes, as a result of, again, this southern Illinois suspicion of what the French were doing at Peoria and their friendliness with the Native Americans. During the War of 1812, the governor of Illinois organized a raid on the Indian villages just north of the lake in the Chillicothe, Metamora area. And as during those raids, there were some American militia that were sort of left behind, and they thought they were fired on by the French villagers. They came ashore from their boats in the middle of the lake, arrested all the French villagers, and burned a portion of the village. They transported the French villagers down south to Alton, where the governor pardoned them all, but that was the end of the French settlement here in Peoria.
And when he mentioned the governor of Illinois at the War of 1812, Illinois became a state in 1818. I believe the governor of the territory was Ninian Edwards at the time, and he became governor later in the 1820s. And then in 1818, Illinois becomes a state. Shadrach Bond becomes its first governor. And in 1819, Seth and Josiah Fulton come up to Peoria from down in southern Illinois, down near St. Louis, and come up and they start a ferry service across the Illinois River. And that is where most of us remember the current Peoria as having its origins. Then in 1835 it was incorporated as a town, 1845 it was incorporated as a city, and that brings us to a time when the city said, there's a lot of good stuff here to make whiskey.
Oh yeah. Peoria was blessed with very good quality water, first from the limestone springs and the bluffs on the western side of the river, and later on when that became insufficient with wells into the San Cody Aquifer. But beyond that, grain, oak trees to make barrels for aging the whiskey, but more than anything else, it was the influx of immigrant Irish and Scots who were familiar with distilling whiskey, and also with some important entrepreneurs who knew how to take this business and make it grow.
Marilyn, if you tell us a little bit about that, because there were three waves, major waves of immigration, the Irish, the Germans, the Lebanese.
And a lot of the originals who moved from like Vermont, New Hampshire, those places, they were looking for better land.
A lot of rocky land up in New England.
Oh, very. So they were very, very pleased to come to the prairies and farm here. And then the Irish were coming down, starting, the 1840s was the I&M Canal. When they finished working there, moved to the cities, came downriver from that. Others were being actively recruited. Flanagan, who the father was from Ireland, John Flanagan was from Pennsylvania, but the father was buying government lands, because once the natives had been driven off, once the French had been driven off, those claims were fought all the way through, but the government took the land west of the Illinois River, and that was government land. So Flanagan was buying government land and then actively recruiting Irish coming up from New Orleans.
And there is Flanagan House. For those of you who have not gone to Flanagan House, the Peoria Historical Society has a house on Glen Oak Avenue in Peoria that dates from 1837?
1837, but he was farming along the Kickapoo, and along the Kickapoo, there were French claims because they wanted the coal that was being discovered there. But anyway, that wave of Irish coming in up from New Orleans, and then Germans were coming because there were wars, wars in Germany.
And we're going to talk about the Germans in just a moment, but I want to go back to 1837 because that's a significant date for the brewing and distilling industry in Peoria.
Right. The brewing industry started here in 1837. A man named Andrew Idle built the first brewery. In 1843, Almiron Cole built the first whiskey distillery here. And that's where things really took off.
And of course, the things that you talked about, the water and the transportation, et cetera. Right. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the growth of whiskey, but it became the most profitable here in Peoria of any place in America.
Very much. By the turn of the century, even in 1850, Peoria became very prominent in the whiskey industry. But at the turn of the century, Peoria was making 2.5 times more whiskey than the closest competitor. In 1899, Peoria distilleries produced 24,760,000 gallons of whiskey. If you work that out, that's 2,827 gallons of whiskey every hour around the clock.
And that generated a lot of tax for the government.
That generated a considerable amount of tax for the federal government. Congress passed a luxury tax with the beginning of the Civil War, and the 5th tax district of Illinois, mainly Peoria and Pekin, produced more than 50% of all the money raised in all of the northern states under that tax for the federal government.
And during this time, the German influx came.
Yeah, the Germans started coming, before the Civil War, just because of turmoil over in that, all the different parts of Germany. Civil War pretty much stopped immigration, but one of the big whiskey barons who came down to Peoria, Greenhut, was driven out of Chicago by the Great Chicago Fire. He was a Civil War hero, but 1871 was Chicago Fire, and that sent him looking for, greener pastures.
And Joseph Greenhut actually was the head of the Whiskey Trust.
Joseph Greenhut was the chairman of the board of the Whiskey Trust. The Peoria distillers organized a group of over 80 distilleries eventually around the country, and for about 8 years they totally monopolized the production and distribution of whiskey in the United States. They set the price. If supply outran demand, they closed down some of the distilleries in the trust, and eventually they were too successful. They kept the price of whiskey so high that other people were attempted to build distilleries and not join the trust, and the thing fell apart of its own weight.
But whiskey and breweries generated so much money that it actually impacted the entire city of Peoria with some of the buildings.
Oh yes, first of all, the brewers and distillers built their mansions. You still see them on Perry Street on both sides of I-74, all along High Street and along Moss Avenue. They also put some of this money into the entertainment business. The Grand Opera House, built in 1882 here, was heavily financed by distillery money. J.B. Greenhut in 1909 gave most of the money to build the Grand Army of the Republic Hall for the Civil War veterans. In 1910, Edward and Albert Lacey, who owned the largest brewery in Peoria, the second largest in Illinois. Today it's the big white building with the PMP logo on it down by Riverplex. They built a large theater called the Orpheum in 1910, which really started to bring Peoria into the big time, as the vaudevillians called it, with the larger, more prominent performers and the higher salaries.
And I want to talk about who came here, but first we want to get to the Lebanese, because that was the third wave of immigration, the third major wave.
The Lebanese, actually some of them started coming in the 1880s and figured that they would earn money here, go back home. Then Lebanon was having various political, being beset by the Ottoman Turks or other kinds of groups. But Lebanese found work here, whether shoveling coal, working on the railroads, working in the packing houses, found that kind of success, told people at home, heavily from I-2 Lebanon. And then banded together to support each other, and now they're the professional class, whether it's politicians, doctors, dentists, educators. And
then I want to go back to vaudeville, because big names came to Peoria when those theaters were built.
Yes, in 1920, another distiller, William Hull, who was the general manager of the Clark Brothers Distillery, soon to become the U.S. Congressman from Illinois, built the Palace Theater on the corner of Main and Madison. Vaudeville itself, there were always traveling shows that came to Peoria by riverboat and then by railroad. In 1852, Dr. Rudolphus Rouse built Rouse's Hall on the corner of Main and Jefferson, where Commerce Bank is now. It seated 1,200, with quite a large theater for the day. But real vaudeville started in 1881 in New York City. A man named Tony Pastor decided that he was going to present what he called polite vaudeville or clean vaudeville. It had tended toward kind of bawdy notes, but this brought together variety shows of singers, dancers, magicians, animal acts, jugglers, comedians, who traveled together through chains of theaters. The Orpheum in Peoria was one of Martin Beck's Orpheum chain, which was 45 theaters in 36 cities. People, nationally famous, internationally famous acts, the Barrymore family actors, Blackstone the Magician, the great Harry Houdini, Al Jolson. People like this came to Peoria, but the impresarios like Beck, who put together these traveling shows, came to regard Peoria as the ideal test market. It had a good balance of ethnic groups, of rich and poor, and known for being a tough audience. It was hard to get applause in Peoria. So if an act did well in Peoria, they could assume that it would probably do well around the country.
And vaudeville came to an end when movies.
Right.
With the Apollo Theater,
right.
Was that the key?
Right. The Apollo Theater was the first theater in Peoria built specifically to show movies. There'd been Nickelodeons around before that, but in 1914, the Apollo presented Anthony and Cleopatra, a silent movie accompanied by an orchestra and canaries singing, and it went on from there.
And that brings us up to about 1920, but we're going to save that for another conversation when E.N. Woodruff came in. Well, he'd been mayor a couple of times before, but it was the 1920s when we lost the money of whiskey that gambling, prostitution.
Right. There'd always been gambling and prostitution in the River City, but in 1917, when...
We've got to stop there.
Okay.
We're going to talk about those things later on. I'd like to say thank you to the Leylands, John and Marilyn, and thank you to Mike Wyant and to Mark Johnson for sharing a little bit of history with you as we are celebrating the Christmas holidays. We're celebrating the history of Peoria. Join us next time on At Issue when we talk about whether or not the city of Peoria should buy the water company. We'll talk with members of a committee that's been studying that possibility on the next At Issue.